Hello and welcome to Peace Mind in today's episode. If you work in an office, attend meetings, or plan to work in a professional environment, this episode is for you. In the next few minutes, you will learn real English that professionals use every day in meetings. This is not textbook English. This is natural, clear, and confident English used in real workplaces. By the end of this episode, you will know exactly what to say at the start of a meeting, how to share your ideas politely, how to agree or disagree professionally, how to ask questions, and how to end a meeting with confidence. Stay with me until the end because each example is simple, practical, and easy to remember. Let's begin. Imagine this situation. You are sitting in a meeting room or joining a video call. Your manager is there. Your teammates are there. Everyone is waiting for the meeting to start. The first phrase you need is, "Let's get started." This is one of the most common phrases used in meetings. For example, "Let's get started. Thank you everyone for being here today." Another example, "All right everyone, let's get started. We have a lot to discuss. Now listen carefully." This phrase sounds simple, but it sounds confident and professional. Native speakers use it all the time. Another polite way to start a meeting is, "Thank you all for joining." For example, "Thank you all for joining today's meeting." Another example, "Thank you for joining on such short notice." Now let's move forward. After the meeting starts, you may want to introduce the topic. Here is a very professional sentence. Today we're going to talk about... For example, today we're going to talk about our sales performance. Another example, today we're going to talk about the next steps for this project. Now suppose you want to speak during the meeting. You don't want to sound rude. You don't want to interrupt. Use this phrase, "I'd like to add something." For example, "I'd like to add something to what Sarah just said." Another example, "If I may, I'd like to add something here." Here is another polite option. "I'd like to share my thoughts." For example, "I'd like to share my thoughts on this issue." Another example, "I'd like to share my thoughts before we move on." Now let's talk about agreeing with someone. In meetings, agreeing politely is very important. Use this phrase, "I agree with you." For example, "I agree with you. That sounds like a good plan." Another example, "I completely agree with your point." Here is a more professional variation. "I agree with that approach." For example, "I agree with that approach. It's practical and efficient." Now, sometimes you agree but want to add something. Use this phrase, "I agree and I'd also like to add." For example, "I agree and I'd also like to add that we should consider the timeline." Another example, "I agree with that and I'd also like to mention the budget." Now let's talk about disagreeing politely. Disagreeing does not mean being rude. Here is a very professional sentence. "I see your point, but..." For example, "I see your point, but I think we need more data." Another example, "I see your point, but I have a different perspective." Here is another polite way. "I'm not sure I agree." For example, "I'm not sure I agree. I think there may be some risks." Another example, "I'm not sure I agree with that assumption." If this video has helped improve your English even a little, please subscribe to Peace Mind. Now listen carefully. Your tone is very important. Speak calmly and slowly. Next, let's talk about asking questions in meetings. Use this phrase, "Could you clarify that?" For example, "Could you clarify that point, please?" Another example, "Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Here is another common phrase. "Can you explain that a bit more?" For example, "Can you explain that a bit more?" "I want to be sure I understand." Another example, "Can you explain that in more detail?" Now suppose you didn't hear something clearly. Say this, "Sorry, I didn't catch that." For example, "Sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you repeat it?" Another example, "Sorry, I didn't catch the last part." Now let's talk about giving updates. This is very common in office meetings. Use this phrase, "Here's a quick update." For example, "Here's a quick update on the project." Another example, Here's a quick update from my side. You can also say, I'd like to give an update. For example, I'd like to give an update on our progress. Another example, I'd like to give a short update before we move on. Now let's talk about time management in meetings. If you want to keep things short, say, let's keep this brief. For example, let's keep this brief so we can stay on schedule. Another example, let's keep this brief and move to the next topic. If time is almost over, say, we're running out of time. For example, we're running out of time, so let's wrap this up. Another example, it looks like we're running out of time. Now let's talk about making suggestions. Use this phrase, I suggest that we. For example, I suggest that we review this again next week. Another example, I suggest that we focus on the main priorities. Here's another natural option. Maybe we could, for example, maybe we could schedule another meeting. Another example, maybe we could try a different approach. Now suppose you want feedback. Say this, I'd like to hear your thoughts. For example, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this idea. Another example, I'd like to hear your thoughts before we decide. You can also say, what do you think? For example, what do you think about this proposal? Another example, what do you think would work best? Now let's talk about ending a meeting professionally. This part is very important. Use this phrase, to summarize. For example, to summarize, we've agreed on the next steps. Another example, to summarize, our main goal is to improve efficiency. Now say, let's review the action items. For example, let's review the action items before we finish. Another example, let's review who is responsible for what. Then end the meeting with, thank you everyone. For example, thank you everyone for your time. Another example, thank you everyone for your valuable input. Here's a very professional closing sentence. Let's follow up next week. For example, let's follow up next week to check our progress. Another example, let's follow up next week with an update. Now listen carefully. You do not need complex words to sound professional. Simple English spoken clearly is powerful. Native speakers prefer clarity, not complicated language. Practice these phrases. Use them in real situations. The more you practice, the more confident you will sound. That brings us to the end of today's episode. If you want to improve your English for work, keep listening. In the next episode, we'll talk about English for professional emails. Thank you for listening. If you found the video helpful, give it a like, and let us know in the comments what topic you want to see next. And I'll see you in the next episode.